Kremlin spokesman Peskov cynically stated that Kyiv knows perfectly well what needs to be done to stop the massive Russian strikes and the killing of Ukrainians. Quote, Kyiv knows perfectly well what needs to be done to stop the fighting. All these conditions were announced a year ago. Kyiv knows and remembers these statements of Putin's well, said Peskov, the mouthpiece of the Kremlin dictator. In this way, the spokesman probably hinted once again that Moscow demands Kyiv's surrender, and only then will they stop all shelling. And, according to Putin's statements, Peskov is saying what the Russian bunker grandfather once said in June 2024, which is exactly 1 year ago. He stated that the Russian Federation is ready to cease fire and start negotiations only after Ukraine withdraws from Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions, meaning from Ukrainian territories. In addition, the dictator demanded recognition of Russia's seizure of Ukrainian lands in these 4 regions and the temporarily occupied Crimea. He also asked for the lifting of all sanctions against Russia. And, of course, he demanded Kyiv's neutral, non-aligned, and non-nuclear status. The Kremlin dictator also demanded that Ukraine reduce the size of the Ukrainian armed forces and that Western countries not supply us with weapons. All these conditions are conditions of surrender, and so you see Peskov is bluntly and cynically stating that only then will they agree to a ceasefire, not just a cessation of war, but a ceasefire. These conditions are unacceptable. Ukraine will never agree to them. But I wonder if the United States of America sees all these statements. Because what Putin is offering us, and Peskov confirms this, I think it does not coincide at all with the statements and policies of Donald Trump, who said that he would force the Kremlin to negotiate. The Kremlin states they do not need negotiations. Peskov, by the way, also recently said in an interview with the American media that we have a strategic victory, an advantage on the front, so why should we stop now? This is not in our interest, and he says, what negotiations with Ukraine? Negotiations with Ukraine are possible only if it surrenders. Let me remind you that the day before, Putin himself said that Moscow wants the so-called SMO to end with the result it wants. That is what we were talking about a few minutes ago. He also announced that the Russian Federation is supposedly ready for a new round of negotiations with Ukraine, and that the only thing left to do is to agree on a place and time. And by the way, Peskov also confirmed today that the Kremlin still expects talks in the near future, and says that there may be clarity on the 3rd round of talks between Russia and Ukraine. This was stated by Kremlin spokesman Peskov, and I quote, "The Kremlin hopes that the timing of the 3rd round of talks with Ukraine will be clarified in the near future," the Führer's spokesman said. Peskov also said that Moscow would not succumb to pressure from Western countries that are going to impose tougher sanctions on Russia. According to him, Russia will not be forced to negotiate against the end of the war, against Ukraine in particular. This was reported by Welt, and Peskov assured that even the planned 18th package of sanctions imposed by the European Union would not lead to an end to Russia's war against Ukraine. He says that only logic and arguments can force Russia to the negotiating table. It is impossible to force Russia to give in to any pressure or force, the Russian president's spokesman said on Russian propaganda media. But I would disagree with him because it is force that works, and only the language of force is understood by Putin. Because when some large-scale, powerful special operations take place on the enemy's territory, the Kremlin immediately becomes more cooperative. They are ready to talk, they are even ready to agree on the exchange of prisoners, but they are not ready to cease fire. That's where they stand, no matter what we do. But I think that if the pressure was not only from Ukraine, but also from Europe and the United States, including not only sanctions, but also weapons for Ukraine. Something like what happened with Israel. If we were given powerful warheads with which to destroy Russian military facilities, I think Putin would definitely start talking very differently. Peskov also emphasized that he is confident that the new package of sanctions that the European Union wants to impose will eventually be adopted, but he said that there will be a response and a corresponding reaction to this package of sanctions, because according to Peskov, sanctions are a double-edged sword. In addition, the Russian president's spokesman said that Moscow considers the European sanctions illegal. Obviously, after almost 4 years, we have gained some resilience and we have learned to minimize the consequences of such packages, he assured. But somebody probably disagrees with Peskov and Putin, the head of the Central Bank of Russia, Nabiullina Reshetnikov, the head of the Russian economy, because they say that the economy is in big trouble, as Reshetnikov said recently at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, that it is entering a recession, and the recession is the consequences of the Russian war. And sanctions are working. Of course, they don't work the way we would like them to work, so that the Kremlin would stop fighting completely, but it is still a big loss for Russia. This is inflation that cannot be overcome, and this flywheel is still running. I am sure that if these new packages are introduced, they should be implemented, and this will at least force Russia to negotiate on fair terms, not the ones Putin is talking about.